This lecture is going to be about this terrific book here called The Shock of the Anthropocene, um, which I highly recommend. And I'm just going to give a brief survey of it to, I guess, encourage you to read it and to think about what it has to offer. Um, so, one of the reasons why this book is interesting is that it helps us to begin to think about the current situation as a complex set of forces that combine to shape our situation. And one such force is, of course, capitalism itself. Now, capitalism is not singular, it is a highly complex set of interacting systems, if you like, and it manifests in a variety of ways. We tend to think of capitalism as a way of organizing the economy, and sometimes it is contrasted with alternate models such as socialism and communism. But really, this is an instance of ideology at work because, and in this sense, ideology can be understood as a mask for the truth. And this state of affairs is known as false consciousness, a situation in which we think we know the truth or the facts of our situation, but in fact, we don't. So we think capitalism is purely a matter of the economy, as though in fact we know what that is, when in reality its scope is far greater. We could go so far as to say it is a form of life. It is an ethics, it constitutes a value system, a politics, in as much as it also entails a distribution of justice and much more. So we should think of capitalism then as a regime of truth, if you like, to use Foucault's terms, as a way of deciding the value of things and the values we attach to things. And I think it's really important to think of it in this way because it helps us to understand the current situation and why, if what we're being told about climate change is true, we aren't acting. So capitalism regards itself as a just, fair, and inevitable, and perhaps even desirable form, whereby some people think that it's okay for a handful of people to have billions, while millions of people have very little to eat. Capitalism also regards it as necessary to destroy the environment in order for profits to be maintained. And this is a very old idea, but it's kind of bedded into the very idea of the economy itself, whereby a tree in the forest is kind of dead money until it has been chopped down. It only gains value at the point at which it is destroyed. So the authors Bonneuil and Fressoz argue that the term Capitalocene, which was coined by Jason Moore, is better than the Anthropocene because it foregrounds the fact that it is capitalism as a form of life that is directly responsible for the present state of affairs. Now, if, as Frederick Jameson famously said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, then that is because capitalism has been coextensive with the whole world for at least 3 centuries. And the pursuit of capital has encompassed the entire world and indeed threatens to consume the entire world. So, to understand the world today, we need to understand its world systems, they argue, which are the circuits of capital itself. And the other word for this is, of course, globalization. And both refer to the expansion of capital to all corners of the globe. And there are effectively no limits to the expansion of capital that are not intrinsic to the logic of capital itself. This means capital will only stop doing something when it ceases to be profitable, not because it is unethical or destructive or exploitative or anything else. No oil companies are volunteering to stop producing fuel, even though we know this process is causing climate change. So the concept of the world system was developed by a number of scholars, but most prominently by Braudel and Wallerstein, and they use it to describe separate phases of the expansion of capitalism. Each phase is generally associated with a particular country or even city. The first phase was Italian, specifically Genoa, which which profited from its financing of the Spanish conquests of the Americas. Then came the Dutch phase, and despite its vast looting of America, Spain's economy collapsed as it could no longer maintain its European empire, and Holland was liberated. It profited from its trade with its colonies in South America, South Africa, and Southeast Asia, predominantly Indonesia. Then came the British. They profited from their colony in the US, which gave them access to cotton, which was woven into clothing, as well as tobacco and sugar. After the War of Independence, England switched to focus on India as its source of cotton. Last and still the US, which became the world power during World War II. The European economies more or less destroyed themselves, and the US was effectively left without any competition. And the war itself was a massive stimulus to the American economy. So the advantage of the concept of the world system is that it's historical and dynamic, but also global and systemic. World system researchers look at the way specific processes contribute to and profit from globalization. For example, one of the great examples that they like to talk about is guano, which is basically bird poo, used for nitrate fertilizer, which was mined in Chile and Peru and shipped to Europe to fertilize soils depleted from centuries of farming, which in turn led to an increase in agricultural production and population increases. In turn, the supply of guano disappeared when the fish the birds fed off were hoovered up by commercial trawlers. No fish, no birds, no guano, and the system broke down. As is evident from this example, world systems can also be understood in ecological terms. It also shows that prosperity is directly correlated with the monopolization of specific natural resources, for example, oil, and the exteriorization of environmental cost, i.e., making somebody else pay for it. Oil companies profit from selling oil, but we all collectively pay for the environmental damage. And this can be measured and thought about using the concept of the ecological footprint, which tabulates how big a country would actually need to be to generate the productivity it has. And Capitalocene pushes us to think in these terms and recognize that these processes are driven by desire for profit rather than a specific human need. The Anthropocene was fueled by transatlantic trade. It was the pursuit of this trade that eventually led to the creation of the steam mill. This in turn created the need for ships to conduct the trade, as well as finance, contracts, insurance, and so on. No ship owner likes an empty ship, so the constant movement of ships also spurred a range of other trades, this further expanding the idea of trade itself. As the US population grew, so the British economy boomed. The US economy in this period was heavily dependent on slave labor in its cotton, tobacco, and sugar plantations. So one must also say that Britain's rise to its superpower status in this period was similarly soaked in the blood of slaves. Hence the Black Lives Movement when the statue of Edward Colston in Bristol was rolled into the river. The company he worked with transported 84,000 slaves to America. And it's rather a sort of a dark secret that Britain tries to pretend it was never involved in. The wealth of Britain today profits from this foundation laid down centuries before. So to talk about the Industrial Revolution as though it was just a matter of technological superiority is to obscure the real blood and treachery that underpins it. And that is another example of ideology at work. To see technology as standalone is to ignore history. So as Bonneuil and Fressoz report, in 1750, the slave trade was worth 40% of Britain's investment, and it was its most lucrative trade. And its most lucrative trade, sugar, was produced by slaves. So when we read a statistic that says British consumption of sugar increased 25-fold in the 19th century, we have to measure that in the actual misery of slaves who produced it. And remember, slavery wasn't banned everywhere until 1881. The last holdout country was Brazil. And the end of slavery was followed by indentured servitude that was, in many cases, worse. So when the slaves were freed at the end of the American Civil War, they weren't simply given compensation. In fact, the owners of the slaves were given compensation. The slaves themselves were released and they had no money, they had no capital, they didn't have a job. And many of them signed back on as indentured servants and more or less continued to work in a state very similar to the one they were allegedly freed from. There was also an environmental price to pay for this rapidly growing taste for sweetness. It took 50 kilograms of wood as fuel to produce 1 kilogram of sugar. So at the start of the 19th century, British firms produced 177,000 tons of sugar, and this amounted to thousands of acres of deforestation every year. In other words, the current crisis is not just a matter of too much CO2 from burning fossil fuels. It is also a product of destroying the best defense we have against CO2, namely trees. So switching to coal was thus in the first instance considered beneficial to the environment because it slowed the rate at which trees needed to be cut, although they continued to be cut because they needed the timber to build the mines. For example, Britain's coal consumption in 1820 was the equivalent of 8 million acres of trees, which is just astonishing. And the sugar industry also brought malaria and yellow fever to the Americas. Indeed, one of the reasons that African slaves were brought to America because they were thought to be more disease resistant than the white colonial settlers. As European commerce and manufacture grew through the 19th century, so did its dependence on the rest of the world for its raw materials. But far from spreading wealth, as it has sometimes been claimed under the heading of development, what was actually spread was inequality. Peripheral nations, as they're sometimes called in economics, were stripped mined for their resources, then left to wither. This is sometimes referred to as the resources curse, brief wealth followed by prolonged poverty, often with profound environmental degradation. The small island state of Nauru is a perfect example of this. It had phosphate that could be strip mined, which it was, to the point that the island now has a giant crater in the middle of it. And this created a brief economic boom. But once the phosphate was gone, the island sank back into poverty. And that's why it was willing to take money from the Australian government to become a home for asylum seekers. And Naomi Klein has an excellent account of this in her book, This Changes Everything. And it was European wealth that drove the transformation of the entire world. The UK and France invested half their GDP abroad in the 19th century. And this money was largely used to build infrastructure such as ports, roads, and railways and so on, all of which, of course, are resource intensive. This infrastructure, when it was built in peripheral nations, tended to increase their dependency on the centre. It was premised on very few resources or commodities, just sugar or phosphate, for example, and it tended to be subject to monopoly control. And this continues today, even in Australia, the gas depot in Darwin, the iron ore ports in Karratha, and so on. This inequality led to catastrophes such as the great famines that took place in India, China, and Brazil and Ireland in the 19th century. And Mike Davis's book, Late Victorian Holocaust, is quite brilliant on this. In every case, the famine could have been averted because sufficient food was available, but the government instead chose to impose laws of market supply and demand. So they simply allowed the price of things to go up, thus exacerbating the problem. So even in the midst of famines, which killed millions, food was exported from these countries, and people were allowed to profit from hoarding food, even as others starved just a few miles down the road. So the colonial period thus laid the foundation for the great acceleration that began in World War II, when which people debate as the beginning point for the Anthropocene. And some date it with the invention of the steam engine, others with the atomic bomb. Both are wrong according to Bonneuil and Fressoz, because what really matters are the tectonic shifts in capitalism. The Great Acceleration is so named because industrial capitalism grew so fast, it made the colonial era look sluggish by comparison. The world we know today took shape post-World War II. Between 1950 and 1970, the global population grew by 46%. This is the so-called boomer generation. The growth in wealth in this period depended heavily on a massive expansion of the uptake of fossil fuels, cars, jet planes, plastics, roads, and so on. And this is when globalization really began.